In the tradition of Malcolm X, peace be unto you. While you've been asking for reparations, white supremacists have been doing what they always do to us. They've been taking our money. There are many ways that we have been duped into growing wealth for white supremacists. But all those ways have one thing in common. Each is predicated on our willingness to trust some of the major financial institutions, political celebrities, and people in our communities who promote those institutions. The truth is that we are no different than the millions of American descendants of slaves who lived out their lives in past generations. They misplaced their trust, and we have been misplacing our trust too. We have been putting our trust in people who mean us no good, none. We are being duped again and again, and it won't stop until we stop it. The truth is, we have been living out our lives on a massive financial plantation. We have been and are literally its slaves. We have been growing wealth in many forms for every other ethnic group but our own. It's not just the money made on our bodies in private, state, and federal prisons. It's much, much more than that. And that is exactly what the power elite don't want you to know. They don't want you to know because their maintenance of your ignorance through all the channels of their media is crucial to the smooth operation of their confidence game being played on you. So let's talk about the primary mechanisms which have been driving your monetized status. First, the Federal Reserve Bank, which is similar to the Bank of England. And secondly, the Internal Revenue Service. Both are instituted or were instituted in the year 1913. They were instituted specifically to monetize, let me repeat that, monetize American citizens. The Federal Reserve Bank was instituted by an act of Congress and signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson, whereas the Internal Revenue Service was instituted by the states as the 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The Rothschilds and J.P.Morgan families, along with U.S. senators and congressmen, were the forces who pushed the two forms of legislation. You can see that when elite white supremacists want monetized Americans, they can push it through Congress, whereas American descendants of slaves who have been demanding that Congress act to give us reparations cannot even get a congressional bill to the floor of the House or the Senate. Congress does not respond to our demands for social justice. Congress responds to money-making schemes engineered by dominant white supremacists or military-industrial complexes. But my talk is limited, so let me start getting to the point. My concern in this talk is narrowly defined. I only want to focus on what for us are two important characteristics of both the Federal Reserve Bank and IRS. Thus, my talk is limited to the effects on financial quality, the financial quality of life for American descendants of slaves from a very little talked about angle. It is one of the most benign forms of exploitation ever perpetrated on American descendants of slaves. The first characteristic of the Federal Reserve Bank is what I call, or what is called, the reserve banking system. The reserve banking system is a banking method devised in Europe by early bankers or goldsmiths. And secondly, I want to talk about a specific law under the IRS. It is the United States Code 501c3, nonprofit tax-exempt status, for nonprofit religious corporations. Both the reserve banking system and 501c3 tax-exempt legal status have been and are curses on American descendants of slaves. For over 116 years, both the reserve banking system and 501c3 nonprofit religious corporations tax-exempt status have functioned to normalize religious corruption in our communities and to push whole communities into financial sinkholes, trapping American descendants of slaves in inescapable poverty throughout the United States. It just so happens that at the same time America was industrializing at a rapid pace, thousands of descendants of slaves were streaming into growing port cities. They were escaping Jim Crow Southern repression and poverty. They were searching for jobs and educational opportunities. They were poor and they were illiterate. They were also generally very religious. So churches started to spring up everywhere. The founders of the Federal Reserve banking system have had hundreds and maybe thousands of years of recorded history to learn and experience dealing with human greed and how to churn it. The Federal Reserve banking system allows banks to loan out, for example, 90% of church deposits, as long as they reserve at least 10% cash on hand for daily withdrawals. Churches deposit their tithes in hundreds of banks nationwide. The tithes then become the sole property of the bank to do with as they please. Being able to loan out a depositor's money is literally giving free unearned money to banks to use to make money for themselves by earning interest on loans made with the depositor's money. The loans are generally made to businesses outside of our communities, and so billions of dollars deposited by churches nationwide work to further the development of other communities. Banks rarely worked to loan American descendants of slaves to build up their housing, their businesses, their educational facilities. And to add insult to financial injury, most church leadership don't even provide burial insurance for their longtime church members. The IRS tax-exempt income status attracted thousands of psychopaths, religious frauds, and hustlers into church ministries across this nation. A church was for them a place to legally monetize a congregation, just as the Catholic Church did in medieval Europe. They called it the indulgence or indulgences. It was a place where they could have some power, some money, and, of course, some sexual opportunities, and at the same time be functionally illiterate without anyone ever knowing it. Each of those personality traits make for a classic definition of the passion for distinction. They are traits rooted in our basic human instinctual insecurities, and as such, that passion is common among all other animals. However, preachers' passion for distinction was and is hardly a justifiable motive for them to claim that they have a spiritual calling to make or take money from you to give to their masters. White supremacist bankers have been quite adept at triggering those passionate insecurities among some American descendants of slaves. And by doing so, they unleashed in every community, every neighborhood across this nation where we lived, irrelevant religious rivalries. And that in turn drove shameless greed and division along the lines of ridiculous Bronze Age mythologies. Thousands of preachers were very successful at instigating thought chaos. They were thus able to carve out a monetized congregation for themselves among our people. It didn't matter to them that their own people were still in the throes of plantation ignorance. It didn't matter at all. The fact that American descendants of slaves did not evolve within themselves an authentic spiritual insight and tradition set them up for social schism. Thus, they borrowed from the Torah and New Testament a hodgepodge of verses centered on what was taught to them about Jesus on the slave plantations of the South. The same thought chaos persists to this day because each religious orientation must fashion, twist, and morph Bronze Age myths in such a way as to differ from others to maintain control over their congregation. That is why nearly all preachers must deny the scientific method and evidence as the basis for doctrinal credibility. By denying the scientific method, they were enabled to claim that they were in possession of the truth, the true religion, without proof. They could thereby lock their monetized flocks into the churches under their control for life. What they did and continue to do is spread their brands of religious franchises across our communities. But it wasn't and is not just a matter of spreading their brands of religious franchises. What the preachers did was to instigate infinite varieties of political, ideological, and Bronze Age mythological divisions among us. At the same time, there has been virtually no financial cooperation between them, and for the banks, that was a collateral benefit. It is called divide and conquer. Instead, thousands of denominational churches competed with each other to grow church membership, which would give them leverage to qualify for bank loans and preacher perks. What the bankers knew is that poor descendants of slaves had no money to deposit in the banks, in either a savings or checking account. But what they also knew is that American descendants of slaves were religious and would more or less tithe in churches because they believed in Bronze Age mythology. For example, it says in Leviticus, and I quote, "A tithe of everything from the land, whether grain from the soil or fruit from the trees, belong to the Lord. It is holy to the Lord." Now, this is one of the many verses which exemplifies a Bronze Age method of extortion, which succeeds only when people are ignorant and fearful. Descendants of slaves met and meet the qualifications perfectly, and they met it after slavery as well as during slavery. Early on, during the first half of the 20th century, most churches were promoted by Prince Hall Masons, to which most of the ministers were initiated. Some knew and were willing to be agents for the financial institutions, while others were just simply ignorant of exactly what white supremacist financial institutions were doing with church money. In other instances, they were selfish, narcissistic financial opportunists. In still other instances, they were and are just simply crazy individuals. What attracted them was the prospect of making a lot of money and gaining fame in the theater of our communities, played out in segregated America. As long as they serve the interests of financial institutions, which they are compelled to do, no branch of the American justice system will take seriously the fraud they perpetrate against illiterate and poor American descendants of slaves. So we must make a decision to not support these financial institutions and to instead channel our money into our families to support them and only them. I am Dr. Stephen Nur Ahmed. Peace be unto you.
You did as well. If you enjoyed Stephen's talk, please support this channel, thumbs up, and share this video. And please do not forget to subscribe.